Okay, so in this week we are going to look at Roman society as it was developing in really the late 600s, 500s, and we'll push down into the 400s into the second lecture. And I do want to stress again, a lot of the information we have about this particular time period is written a little bit later. So some of it we're dependent on later texts where people are writing back about what had happened in their history. So you have to be careful with that. But we do have some archaeology that will hopefully tie in these. Okay, and what I've done on this slide is I've taken some information from an article that was optional reading for you. It was on Roman class structure in pre-Etruscan Rome. And I thought the author did a pretty good job at trying to break down at least the population of people. So it sort of makes sense when you read it and it's talking about the class structure. I do want to point out, if you're not a history major, or if you're a history major as well, this is really a Marxist version of history where it's production of things, the division of land led to class structure. Anyway, so if you look through this article, the author will start breaking down the populations for you. So on page 431, Ward says, you know, the patricians or the wealthy people made up maybe 1.5% of the total population, so a very small population. And then you've got the middle, what Ward calls the middle class, which I don't know if I would actually call it the middle class, but it's the people sort of not wealthy and not super poor. They make up about 84% of the population. And then what he calls peasantry, and this is described on 434, makes up a small portion of these classes. Now again, you have to be careful here. Modern scholars are usually trying to reconstruct what's happening back in the late 600s and in the 500s, and this is exactly what this author is doing. I put this map up here because it's actually really good. If you look on Ward, page 436, what it's showing you here is, let me see if I can write on here. So right here in the center is the size of what the author thought Rome was in this particular time period, and then as time goes on, it gets larger and larger, and then finally you get these walls being built around the entire area. I've given you a few primary texts to read. One is from Dionysus of Halicarnassus, 4.84. And this one, as I put here, you should have already read now. It's a story about Brutus and the formation of the government and the consuls who will ultimately be the two leaders of the Roman Republic, right on down to the end when you get to Julius Caesar. So be sure that you've looked over that text again. And I've also given you a little bit here from Dionysius, his 5.70 on the creation of the dictatorship. So what we'll find is that you have a series of social structures or government structures built within the early Roman Republic, and at the top are the consuls, so you'll have two consuls. So if you remember, we talked about the use of kings in Rome during the early period. We talked about some of the myths about Brutus getting rid of the kings. And so the Romans had to decide what type of government they were going to have after this. And so according to tradition, which probably isn't totally true, but anyway, according to a tradition that Dionysus has, Brutus decided that there would be two consuls instead of one king. And what Dionysus here is also writing about is that occasionally the Romans would elect someone called a dictator. Now, a dictator in modern day terms is a bad person, but in the Roman period, a dictator was not, at least in the Roman Republic. It was, it's coming from the Latin word dico, which means I speak. And it really means that this person would speak for the entire Roman people. And usually they chose a dictator when there was a military crisis, where instead of having one person making a decision, you'd actually have two. So what you might want to do is stop the video and then read through this little bit of text and make sure that you understand that this dictatorship, Dionysius calls it a magistracy, so a judgeship, was limited to 6 months. And as you can see from this text, and there's a little bit later text, and I'll give you a link to this whole thing, where it's pretty clear that dictators rule for only a short period of time, and they're more popular the shorter period that they rule. And then what they end up doing is, after the military crisis or whatever the crisis is gets solved, they give their power back to the consuls. Okay, now I've got quite a bit of text here. This is from Livy 2.32.1 to 33.2, and this is on a story about how you have you now have the consuls. You have a decision to create a dictator when it's needed, but you also have this story, and this runs through a number of different primary texts that were written quite a bit later about what are the normal people doing, what are a group of people called the plebeians or the common people are doing. And according to these written sources, the plebeians want their own power. They don't want the consuls and these patricians ruling over them entirely. And so what Livy has here is a little story about how the plebeians actually left the city and moved out and sat on another hill and decided that they were just going to sit there until the consuls and the patricians gave them some type of power. And as you read through Livy, this is another case where you'll have to stop the video and read this text. As you read through Livy, you'll notice that the patricians, according to Livy, are getting worried. What happens if there's a war? What happens if this? And what we hear from Livy after this is that the plebeians are given some of their own political power. Okay, now I've pulled a little bit of information from another article that you should have read on the origins of the Forum Romanum. And what this article, the reason I gave you this article to read is that this is some of the archaeology that's taking place about the same time as these texts are talking about creating this new government, this new republican government with the consuls at the top and then everyone else. When you look at the archaeology that's happening, something big is happening in Rome, maybe in the late 600s, at the beginning of the 500s. And so this article is talking about the development of the Forum, which will become the center of Roman power. And it seems like in the 650s down to the about 575, this is actually the case. So if you reread this article, look on page 641, 642, the Forum was actually, where it was a pretty swampy area, and we've talked about this before. What they ended up doing is using over 10,000 cubic meters of material and filling this sort of ditch-like area in to make it flat, and then they paved it over with gravels. And then, so okay, we've got this evidence. What does that mean? And we'll talk about this in just a bit, but you can see that that's not an easy thing to do, to move 10,000 cubic meters of anything. If you've done any type of yard work, you know that is a massive amount. So what it's telling you is there must be a government, there must be people who are willing to work on the society and to work on this particular area, which might have some religious significance, certainly significance for the government. And we also know that there were two other areas that somehow a government had its people fill in other two areas, and these are pretty massive. So don't just think, oh wow, that's kind of interesting, they filled in this giant area. Think about what it's telling you. It's telling you about social structure. It's telling you about government. It's telling you about economy. So all those things are tied in, and what we can do now is try and think about how it's tied in to the stories that were written centuries after this. What I've got here is a possible design of the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. A fairly large structure, and I've given you the link here where I've gotten this. So you've got them filling in the Forum with 10,000 cubic meters of material. You've got large buildings going up sometime in the 500s. Again, what this is really telling us is that there is a government, there is an economy, there is a social structure about regarding who's building this and who's directing the building. We may not know all the details, but that's exactly what these buildings are telling us. And I've just sort of recapped in this particular slide. What does all this tell us? In particular, we have an organized government now. The literature, the primary texts are really telling us this, that the government is getting organized. The archaeology is really telling us what this government is doing once they get organized. And of course, with all these large buildings and all this infill being done, you've got a large number of people who are working on this. So its population levels are hard to guess during this period, but it's probably between 100 and 300,000 people. And so it must be that quite a few of these people are actually doing the work. And it's possible that you have some type of slavery during this period. But I have to say there's a lot of debate over that. Let's stop here, and then I will have another lecture on more specifically on what these classes are and how they're broken down.